Hey guys, today we'll be talking about a subject that you've probably heard about before. We are talking about Les Pilgrims. It's just the Pilgrims. Anyway, to talk about the Pilgrims, we need to understand that we're moving away from the Chesapeake. That's the Virginia, Maryland area that we've been discussing with English colonization. We'll be traveling up northward to the New England colonies. And I'm going to talk about it in a second, but actually, the term New England came from a figure you are also familiar with. That man was John Smith. John Smith, after he had to go back to England after that cannon accident that took him away from his beloved Pocahontas, so to speak, actually goes back to the New World, to the Americas, on several exploration journeys. And he will map out a lot of the coast, including the New England coastline, which is how the pilgrims are going to understand where they're at when they get thrown off course due to violent storms. So that is due to John Smith. All right. Before we could talk about the Pilgrims and the Massachusetts Bay Colony and all of that, you need to understand the term Puritan. Remember that King Henry VIII, well, I'm Henry VIII, though I am, with his merry 6 wives. 2 of them got their heads cut off. Not so merry. He is going to begin the English Reformation, tied into the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century of Martin Luther. But basically, remember, this is the split where you have Protestantism emerging from the Catholic Church. The Christian faiths are splitting in Europe. It leads to a series of violent wars between Protestants and Catholics, and that took place in England as well. Like, for instance, Henry's daughter Mary brought back Catholicism and persecuted Protestants under her reign. And then when Henry's second daughter Elizabeth, when she took the throne after Bloody Mary's death, she brings back the Protestantism, the Church of England, or the Anglican Church that her father had started, where the monarch of England is basically the leader of that church. So the Church of England in practice actually resembled very closely the old Catholic Church with a lot of the same trappings, icons, and many of the same rules. And so there were a lot of Protestants, members of the Anglican Church in England, who felt kind of betrayed by this fact. They wanted to have more of a difference between the new Church of England and the old Catholic Church they thought they were moving away from. And so those people became known as the Puritans because they wanted to purify the Church of England of its Catholic rituals. Okay. They want to get rid of the idolatry. They want to get rid of the pageantry. They want a more personal God. They want their ministers instead of priests to be more accessible and more down to earth. They want to be able to have discussions, men and women to be able to discuss the Bible, basically in a congregation like setting. Instead of the very ritualistic Catholic practices. So they're looking to purify. That's where that term comes from. And you'll actually have in New England, especially in the Massachusetts area, named after the Massachusetts Indians, you will have thousands of English people, Puritans, immigrate from about 1620 to the 1640s. Now, because of the English Civil War, that's kind of going to become complicated in the 1640s, so immigration drops off. But from the beginning of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630 until 1641, huge numbers come over in what we call the Great Migration. Now, please don't get confused with this Great Migration and a later Great Migration we're going to be talking about with the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s of African Americans. Both of them have the same term, but different time periods, different areas of the United States, and different people we're talking about. So there is that to consider. Regardless, so many people come over that you're actually going to have, in addition to also the type of people are coming over, they're coming over in family groups, more women are coming over. It's a better climate, it's healthier because there's less mosquitoes. Think about how Jamestown was basically in a swamp. Lots of mosquitoes proliferating, lots of diseases. You don't have that as much in New England, and so there's going to be a much steadier rise in population, so much so that every 27 years since 1630, the population of New England was doubling. And so by 1700, there's 91,000 people in New England colonies, and that's going to be way more than exist in the southern colonies, the middle colonies, the Chesapeake, or even in the West Indies, in the Caribbean islands. This English population basically booms. In this specific time period of like the Massachusetts Bay Colony coming over right there, that's going to be the Great Migration. So if you're a Puritan, remember you believe in purifying the Church of England. Now, where do these Puritan ideas come from? And remember, also, big picture, Puritan is a type of Protestant Christianity. So these are all Christians that we are talking about. I know that gets confusing. Feel free to pause, rewind, do what you need to do. But we're talking about Puritans who are part of Protestantism, who are part of Christianity. And Puritans get their ideas from the Swiss born philosopher, um, Calvin. And Calvinism basically specifies the belief that man is sinful and only through the grace of God can we be saved. He believed that all people are basically sorted into two lots in life. You're either the elect or you're the damned, which is pretty self explanatory, but I'll go into it anyway, because you know I would. The elect are those who are saved. They're basically those who are bound for heaven. The damned are those who are bound for the HE double hockey sticks place, down under. Um, and to understand which lot you've been cast as, because your fate has already been determined. That's a big part of Calvinism, is this predetermined fate that God has already, before you're even born, God has already assigned you to be either elect, which means saved, or damned, which means you're going to hell. But to understand which way you've been cast, that's why you need to live a good life, because those are the signs on which place you're ending up as. So for a good Puritan, those people who are going to be settling in New England, in the Massachusetts, the Connecticut, the Rhode Island area, and above it, in all this area, that's largely determining why these people live the way they do. And they are very strict, religious, uptight people, these Puritans, because of this belief that if they act out, if they do bad things, that's a sure sign that they're damned. Versus if they live good, godly lives, pure lives, then that shows that they are saved. And everything you do in your life wants to be about making sure you are one of those saved people, those elect people, that you have that saintly grace. In fact, if you were one of the elect and you'd become a full church member, um, you would actually be called a visible saint. And that was usually done by testifying about a conversion experience. And you only be a man, although women were granted church membership status. These visible saints, these men who were full members of the church, those are going to be the only ones who can vote. But small congregations, um, town leadership, local government, that's going to also be a big part of this Puritan belief system that they bring to these New England colonies. Please keep in mind differences in family structure, that in the Chesapeake, those that were coming over, think about John Smith. He's a swashbuckling hero out to find adventure and, loving them good ladies and stuff. At least he says so, right? Um, Most men that came to Jamestown in Virginia, they were looking for a prophet. Very few women came during its early years. In fact, those women had a lot more status and rights than women elsewhere because there were so few of them. Versus in New England, a lot of these Puritans, they settled as family groups. A lot more women came over. Women were also expected in New England to have children much earlier. The average age was 22 versus in the Chesapeake, it was more like 26 after they had, many of these women came over in the Chesapeake, that's Virginia, Maryland. They came over as indentured servants. Remember how important labor was because they're doing that labor intensive farming of tobacco. And so your indenture wouldn't end until your contract was up. So a lot of these women would not be able to settle down and have children until they were older, until they were like 25, 26. Versus in New England, the average age of a woman having marriage and children was 22, and she would on average have about 7 children in her lifetime. Now, child mortality rates, children dying in birth and mothers dying in birth was much, much higher during this time. So a lot of these babies do not make it. But there is a marked difference in population growth between these colonies for these reasons. So keep that in mind. It's also why New England colony is going to be so much bigger in population, at least the white populations. Um, Also, geographically, remember that in New England, there's small family farms for subsistence. In the Virginia, Maryland, the Chesapeake area, these farms were more plantation style, meaning they were for generating a profit, a cash crop like tobacco, or eventually, like in the deep south, like cotton will be, or indigo, or rice, like in the Carolinas. And so you will need a cheap labor supply, huge labor supply that came in the form first of indentured servants and then is replaced after like Bacon's Rebellion. It starts becoming replaced largely by African slaves entirely by the end of the 1700s. You don't have that developing in New England because the difference in economy and geography, as well as family structures, background to these colonies, the history, all of these factors combined. All right, so now to the Pilgrims, and you're like, I know them. They wear those funny buckle hats, and they like their turkey because that's where we get Thanksgiving. Well, you're not entirely wrong, guys, so pat yourselves on the back. Good job. The Pilgrims, though, often get confused with the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And that's because all of these English colonists that come over in the early 1600s to New England are going to be Puritan. Not all of them, but a lot of them, though, especially the ones who found these colonies. Um, but the difference between the Pilgrims and the Massachusetts Bay Colony, because they're all Puritans, is that the Pilgrims were like hardcore. Okay. They were Puritan separatists, meaning they don't want to just purify the Church of England. They want to separate from the Church of England because they think it's beyond saving, basically. So they just want to get the heck out of there, and they want to be able to raise their children in the religious practices they see best. So we often talk about, and you've heard probably in your grade school American history courses, how the first American settlers, the first English settlers that come to America, they came for religious freedom. And that is broadly true, but that also negates a lot of the nuance. So understand this, the Pilgrims did come over for religious freedom, but what that means is that they wanted the freedom to practice the religion they saw as truth. And they wanted that to be free from others' influence and interference because they don't respect other beliefs, which I find very interesting. But basically, the history here is about a decade or so before the Pilgrims immigrate to the Americas in 1620. So it's about 1608. A lot of these Puritan separatists or Pilgrims, as they're going to be called, they actually go to the Netherlands, to the Dutch, to Holland, it was called, and they settle in Amsterdam. Now, I don't know if any of you have been to Amsterdam. I've only been once many years ago, but that is a cool city. But not exactly the place for strict, religious, very uptight, Puritan separatists. There's a red light district where there's all kinds of painted ladies, ladies of the night, offering their wares, if you know what I mean. There's lots of seedy criminal activities. There's lots of, smoking and eating all kinds of fish and other stuff. And today you can bike. It's all kinds of biking. There's canals, and it's a really cool city. But it was way too liberal, way too free a place for the pilgrims. They saw their children becoming enamored of these freedoms that were offered in Holland and being um, influenced by all the various cultures that came through Holland. Holland was, a crossroads of European cultures. And the pilgrims did not like seeing the influence that all of this stuff was having on their kids. Their kids started to leave the faith. And so that is one of the biggest reasons why the pilgrims are going to pack up and they are going to get way out of the known world and bravely go to the Americas, which at this time was just this big dark question mark of like what the heck is out there. Nobody really knew. 1620, it was just still being discovered. But they go all the way over this, and that's why they're called pilgrims, because they made a pilgrimage all the way across the Atlantic to settle in this far off place. And originally they were chartered for Virginia, because remember that was the English colony at Jamestown. But a giant storm pushes their ship northward off course. And of the original 150 that make the trip, only about 102 survive. And I think it's also important to understand that only about a third of those original 102 survivors were actually what we would classify as Puritan separatists or pilgrims. The rest were, some Dutch people, carpenters, the sailors on the ship. There was the Speedwell and the Mayflower. Speedwell was unable to complete the journey, had to turn around. The Mayflower was the only one that completed it. But a lot of these people were not pilgrims that made this first trip. Only about a third of them. So of the pilgrim men who survived the journey, when they realized that they were so far off course, and they knew where they were because of John Smith mapping that coastline, they have to decide what to do. Some of them voted to turn back, and others advocated a different route. And eventually they decided to agree to obey all just laws enacted by their own choosing, basically to create a representative government. And that gave them to the right to decide, okay, since we're off course and we're going to be settling in this area that is not really England's, I guess we will be in charge of ourselves and we will make our own laws for ourselves and we will decide who's in charge of us for us. You could almost say, in the words of Lincoln, a government of, by, and for the people. And this, of course, became the Mayflower Compacts. It is the first constitution in the Americas and one of the first constitutions, in the world. It's a really big deal. Not so much for the numbers it's going to include, because, like I said, very small number of these people were pilgrims, and plus, we're talking a very small number of people in general. But what they're doing for this time period in 1620 is revolutionary, creating a government that was by the people and for the people, a representative style government. Um, that was very new and exciting. So that's the Mayflower Compact. Luckily, when the Pilgrims arrived, they came to an area. They come to the Cape Cod Peninsula, and they keep searching along the coastline there in Cape Cod Bay for a place to land. And eventually, they settle on Plymouth. So Plymouth is going to be the place for the Pilgrims, the Puritan separatists. Later on, we're talking about the much bigger Puritan migration, the Great Migration. Those Puritans will settle in a little bit further along the coast in Boston. And so that's the Massachusetts Bay Colony. They're a little bit late, like 10 years later. This is the Pilgrims at Plymouth. The area that they first settle, it was super lucky. And of course, this is also why they see themselves as graced by God because of their luck. But it was a place that had previously, in the past 3 years, been ravished by a smallpox epidemic. And like 90% of all of the local Wampanoag Native American tribes that were there had been killed or wiped out by this disease. And they had also, they'd farmed the land and gotten everything cultivated and ready. They'd even stockpiled a lot of crops for the winter. And the Pilgrims arrived just weeks before the winter set in, but there was these stockpiles of crops from the Native Americans, and there were even like dead bodies of natives, which should have tipped them off that there was a major disease that had broken out 1617. But basically, the Pilgrims had luckily food supplies to get them through the winter, although almost half of them will die in that first winter regardless. New England winters are very cold. Another really lucky thing that happens, besides there being very few Native Americans to stop them and there being that stockpile of food, another really lucky thing for the Pilgrims was that of the Native Americans that they encounter, two of the first ones that they see and come into contact with actually greeted the Pilgrims in English. Now take a second, right? You are this English colonist coming over to this strange new world, almost like an alien planet. That'd be like us going to Mars and then finding, understanding that there are Martians hidden under the surface or something. We're going to go see them. We're going to be the first people to talk to them. And they greet us in English. It's like, what the heck? This first Native American that they meet, his name was Samoset. And then he goes back to his chief, Massasoit, and this is of the Wampanoag people. And Massasoit brings another Native American who actually spoke even better English, named Squanto. Well, Squanto and Samoset, they had learned English because for decades, for like the past 100 years, there had been European fishermen who had been going up and down the New England coast fishing and trading with local Native American groups and sometimes capturing Native Americans and taking them back to Europe. That had happened to Squanto. He actually didn't just speak his Native American language and English, he also spoke Spanish, which is very impressive. He didn't have Rosetta Stone or anything. And then eventually Squanto got his freedom and he worked his way back to his people. And so this was incredibly fortuitous for the Pilgrims, and it's going to definitely enable them to have positive Native American interactions. And so the following autumn, after about a year of toiling and trying to survive, there is this general feast with about, it's recorded, 90 Native Americans to celebrate the harvest, to celebrate their survival and their alliance with the local tribe. And that became the first New England Thanksgiving. The Pilgrims are going to be prolific. Like I said, family groups, women having lots of children, marrying younger. About 10% of all Americans, European descendant Americans today, can trace their ancestry back to that original voyage of the Mayflower, which is very impressive. Okay, and I realize I'm cutting this kind of long for my videos, so we will talk about the other Puritan group, the ones that come about a decade later, the Massachusetts Bay Colony. We'll talk about them in the next lesson. Thank you guys so much for listening, and I will see and talk to you later.